وبركاته. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. There is no doubt that the cooperation and the unity of the Muslim Ummah is both beneficial and necessary. A result of unity is the agreement or the consensus on issues which benefit the nation as a whole. And this is why Allah says in the Quran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, that hold steadfast to the rope of Allah and do not divide amongst yourselves. Scholars of jurisprudence, when discussing the subject of cooperation from a juristic point of view, they bring up one issue. This issue is referred to as Al-Ara al-Mahmuda. Al-Ara al-Mahmuda refers to the opinions and the views which are praiseworthy and which are based on sound judgment. And these opinions, which are based on sound judgment, are a result of the cooperation and the agreement of like-minded people of a society, of a community. So there are things which, as a society, we agree upon. Their existence is necessary in order to preserve the order. So for instance, traffic laws are considered among the things which are enforced and respected by society. Meaning that even if a government should one day decide to suspend its traffic laws, people who base their daily lives on sound judgments, who base their decisions on sound judgments, would still abide by traffic laws. So you'd probably see people who would speed and not stop at red lights or stoplights or not give way to others, but that would only be a select few. It wouldn't be everybody. But most people who have sound judgment, people who are reasonable, people who are intellectual, in order to preserve society, in order to preserve the benefit of society, would still abide by these laws. They are restrictions, but they are set in place in order to protect us. I know I can speak on my behalf, and inshallah I base my decisions on sound judgment, and I can speak on your behalf as well when I say that if tomorrow they decide to suspend all of the traffic laws, they say that's it, you can drive as fast as you want, you don't have to stop at the lights, you don't have to stop at stop sign, you can park wherever you want, you can drive on the curb if you want, on the curbside, you don't have to drive on the road. What would happen? There would be anarchy. Myself, I would not want to drive, I would not even want to step outside. I know that these laws, these judgments and these opinions, such as traffic laws, and this is just one example, are endorsed and accepted by the people in a society who have sound judgment and sound reasoning. They say that a while back they were in the newspaper, they were speaking in a certain country, they were appointing the next in line for the throne in this certain kingdom. Usually they appoint the next in line, the second, and they already know who the third and the fourth in line is going to be. The Prophet doesn't appoint anyone, but they know how to appoint people who are going to come after them. So they were saying, in preparation for people accepting him, that they were writing in a newspaper his attributes, his good merits, his characteristics, so on and so forth. So they said among his good attributes is that when he was governor of such and such province, every day he would go to work in the morning at 8 a.m. And among his good attributes is that he would request from his driver to stop whenever there's a red light. This is something very good, that he stops at a red light. Thank you for obeying the laws that everybody else has to go through. This is very generous of you to obey these laws. So these are laws which everyone is subject to. And those people who have sound judgment, those people who base their decisions on sound judgment, abide by these laws. They refer to this, Islamic sociologists and jurists refer to these as al-ara al-mahmuda, opinions which are praiseworthy and based on sound judgments. Now, taking it one step further, scholars discuss a concept which is known as ijma'. Ijma' in the Arabic language means ittifaq, an agreement. When you say the word ijma', its original meaning is an agreement. However, in Islamic legal terminology, it takes on another meaning. It takes on the meaning of consensus. And a consensus is a general or a widespread agreement. And it refers to solidarity of religious opinion. So if there's a certain opinion regarding a certain matter, whenever there is a widespread agreement, then that is referred to as consensus, ijma'. Ijma', when it is discussed as one of the sources of Islamic law. So when you look at the sources of Islamic law, number one, the most important source of Islamic law, the most binding and authoritative source of Islamic law is what? The Quran. The Quran is number one. Number two, what comes second in line, which is just as binding and authoritative, the Sunnah, the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet, and in our school of thought, the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam as well. Now these are the two most binding, authoritative sources of Islamic law. So when we want to deduct Islamic law, when a mujtahid wants to provide a verdict, a fatwa, he deducts it from these two main sources. When we speak of ijma' and consensus, scholars discuss ijma' and consensus as a third source, a third dalil. Meaning that if there is an issue which is disputed, and we look to the Quran and we find no answer, we look to the Sunnah, we find no answer, then is it possible to look at ijma', consensus, as a source of Islamic law? I'll draw you a picture of what I'm trying to explain. Where would ijma' and consensus take its validity from? And why would it have any validity? Now today, in the field of medicine, usually the common diseases which are prevalent, the common cases, conditions which are prevalent today, there is enough research and there is enough expertise that there is solid evidence that doctors in the medical community today can establish guidelines. They can establish a standard operating procedure. So when it comes to, and may Allah protect us all, certain forms of cancer, kidney cancer or breast cancer or colon cancer, there's textbook research which has been done over the past decades as to how to cure this disease or how to treat this disease. When you talk to a doctor about undergoing a certain treatment or curing a certain disease, what will they tell you? Before going through the procedure or before undergoing the treatment, the doctor will speak to you about your numbers, your chances basically. You have a 15% chance, you have a 20% chance, you have a 50% chance. And they'll usually tell you that this is what the textbook says, right? The textbook says 15%. If you're between the age of 20 and 40 and you want to undergo a certain procedure, then you have a 20% chance. If you're older, you might have less of a chance. If you're younger, you might have more of a chance. They'll refer you to the textbook. And what is the textbook? When they're talking about the textbook, they're talking about the solid evidence that they have, which has been accumulated over years and over decades. And this is based on research and it is based on experience. If you look at doctors going hundreds of years back, doctors used to create, and until today, they create medical journals. In medical journals, they talk about their research and their experience. Going back from Ibn Sina had medical journals. So doctors in the last century, Dr. Walter Friedman, for instance, different doctors, they had medical journals. And when you want to refer to, for instance, the success rate of lobotomy, for instance, you would turn to one of these journals. There's a textbook. There's enough research and expertise so that you would not have to start from the beginning if you do not know what to do as a doctor or as a person who is curing or treating this disease. So there's textbook, there's hard evidence. Now what happens if there is no textbook, if there is no hard evidence? And this is where the issue of consensus comes in. So imagine there's a disease or a condition and there is no evidence whatsoever. There's nothing in the books which tells us what to do. This is where scholars turn to consensus. They turn to ijma'. And ijma' is a popular agreement when there is solidarity in opinion as to what to do, how to cure this issue, how to treat this issue. So if there was a disease and we had no evidence, we had no textbook, we have no standard operating procedure, what do? Most likely, what should be done is that we would refer to doctors and we would ask their opinion. Now, which doctors would we ask? The number one doctors which we would ask, whose opinions we would honor and would actually make sense and we would benefit from, are the most experienced ones. So doctors who have spent maybe a few decades in the medical field. Now, would we also consider the opinion of an intern? We could, maybe. How about a medical student who's in medical school? How about a regular high school student who's read biology, for instance, or someone in college who's taken a certain course? How about a complete, ignorant layman? Or how about a person who's read a few Wikipedia articles, for instance? I've read a few Wikipedia articles on this disease and that disease, and I've memorized a few words. Am I considered a scholar, and is my opinion honored? And we have this in every field, alhamdulillah. Even in religion, we have Wikipedia scholars. They're the students of Sheikh Google and Sheikh Facebook. And all of a sudden they become experts and their opinions are honored. This exists in every field, self-proclaimed experts and scholars. However, when there's an issue which needs treatment, when there's an issue which really requires a cure, do you honor their opinion, or do you only honor the opinion of the scholars who have dedicated their lives towards this? It is obvious that you would honor the opinions of the scholars. So their consensus is the consensus which would provide enough evidence in order for you to continue with the treatment, continue treating the issue. So when we speak about consensus as an independent source, and I'll tell you what we mean by an independent source. Number one, the condition of the ijma', of this consensus, is that this is the opinion of all of the scholars from the beginning of when jurisprudence was actually practiced after the time of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt up until now. When there is solidarity in their opinion, this is when it is considered a legitimate form of consensus. Now, what is it that gives consensus, ijma', its validity? What is it that gives it its convincing strength? Because we said that the Quran is the most powerful source that we have. And then after the Quran comes the hadith. And then scholars discuss after the hadith the consensus. If it is proven to be a legitimate source of Islamic law, well, where does it derive its legitimacy from? What if 100 scholars said that this is right? Who said that all of these scholars are right? This is why when scholars talk about consensus, they also discuss the fact of what gives it its legitimacy. What gives it enough power to be independent from the Quran and the Sunnah and have its own legitimacy by itself. So that if we don't find something in the Quran and we don't find something in the Sunnah, however it becomes a matter of consensus, we can produce a legitimate verdict. I'll give you just an example, and this is just an example, no debating in the example. When it comes to the issue of smoking, smoking is not mentioned in the Quran. If I want to produce a fatwa as a mujtahid, whether smoking is prohibited or whether it is forbidden. And whenever we want to say something prohibited or permissible, whenever we want to say something is prohibited or permissible, we have to have a source to back it up with. The school of thought of Ahlul Bayt is built on the Quran and the Sunnah. It is not built upon our own desires, our own ra'i. Just because I don't like the way cigarettes smell, for instance, then it becomes haram. Is this how we produce Islamic law? Or do we have to have solid evidence? We have to have solid evidence. So when it comes to an issue such as smoking, and I want to produce a verdict to determine whether it is permissible or it is prohibited. In the Quran, smoking itself is not mentioned. Yes, we have verses which say that do not kill yourself, do not commit suicide, and do not facilitate the means for your death. That's true. But today, practically, when scholars who pass a verdict which says that smoking is permissible, they argue against these verses. They say that what is meant here is that which poses an imminent danger and an imminent threat, such as drinking poison, something which will kill you instantly. And they say that smoking doesn't fall under this category. Okay. So, no evidence of the prohibition of smoking in the Quran. Now we go to the Sunnah. When we go to the Sunnah, again, smoking in itself is not mentioned. What we have is similar to what we have in the Quran. So if I wanted to legitimately pass a verdict, present a verdict that says that smoking is not permissible, then I would need to back that up with something which is just as strong as the Quran and the Sunnah. And if I had a consensus of all the scholars, beginning from the first scholars who began to produce fatwa verdicts until now, that would be a legitimate source. So consensus, we are looking at it as an independent source, independent from the Quran and from the Sunnah. Now, practically speaking, in the school of thought of Ahlul Bayt, consensus is not considered an independent source. Consensus exists. When you read the books of jurisprudence, of halal and haram, you will find that many scholars, when they say that such and such is prohibited, or such act is permissible, they'll tell you that one of their reasonings behind that is ijma'. There is consensus. All of the scholars which came before agree that this is prohibited or that it is permissible. However, practically speaking, this consensus which they claim, none of it is independent. What do I mean? That all of these reasonings, they go back to the Quran and to the Sunnah. So if the ijma', the consensus wasn't there, you would still find this law in the Quran or in the Sunnah. So it's not an independent source of law. It's not independent in itself. And that's why when it comes to this, ijma', consensus, scholars say the following. They say the following statement. They say al-muhassal ghair hasil wal-hasil ghair hujja. Meaning what? Meaning that what we are trying to achieve from the ijma' in itself is unavailable. You will not see one consensus from the time that the fatwas began until now, one independent consensus in itself. It's never independent. It's always based on, if it's there, it's always based on either the Quran or the Sunnah. Wal-hasil ghair hujja, meaning that the consensuses that we have today, they are useless, they are valueless. Because again, they depend on the Quran and on the Sunnah. Now, if it doesn't have value, and if it is non-existent, and if it is not an independent source, then why do scholars even discuss consensus in the first place? Why do they discuss it as a source of Islamic law? That's because if you look at the way that the knowledge which is today, which we learn today in the Ahl al-Bayt school of thought, in the Hawza, in the seminary, the manhaj which was produced, the way which was produced, was very similar to other schools of thought. And since other schools of thought, they discussed ijma', consensus, as an independent dalil, as an independent source of information, Shia scholars also followed suit. But in reality, it either has no value or it is non-existent. But why did it come up in the first place? The first ijma' which was claimed was regarding what issue? Let me test your knowledge. What issue was it regarding? Now this is an issue which cannot be found explicitly in the Quran, and it cannot be found explicitly in the hadith of Rasulullah. And that it is of extreme importance. What was that? The imamah, the khilafah which took place after the martyrdom of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So it is considered independent. Why? Because when it came to the khilafah, the dispute over the khilafah, how do we treat this dispute? The khilafah which took place after Rasulullah. Is there anything in the Quran which says, follow fulan khalifa after Rasulullah? No, quite the contrary. The Quran, in many of the different commands, tells us to follow Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But in order to legitimately establish the khilafah of anyone else, you would need strong proof. And there is no proof whatsoever in the Quran. There is no proof whatsoever in the Quran. So now that there's no proof in the Quran, you have to go to source number 2. Source number 2 is what? The Sunnah. Is there any proof in the Sunnah? None whatsoever. There are fabricated ahadith which say that the Prophet said that if there were to be a prophet after me, it would be fulan, this person. Fabricated, completely fabricated, a complete lie. Or the Prophet said that follow the 2 that come after me. And since the 2 that came after him were fulan and fulan, we have to follow them. A complete fabrication and a complete lie and a complete twisting of the words of the Prophet. So there is no evidence whatsoever in the Quran. There is no evidence whatsoever in the hadith. Here it becomes important to legitimize it through another source. So in order to legitimize what took place, and in the words of the second Khalifa during the end of his life, he says the pledging of allegiance to the first was a falta. Do you know what falta means? What does falta mean in the Arabic language? Falta means a mistake. What happened was a complete mistake. He says on his deathbed that what happened with the first was a complete mistake, a falta. in order to legitimize this falta, this mistake, you either need a source from the Quran or from the Hadith, or something which is just as powerful, just as convincing as the Quran and the Hadith. So that's why you have to create another source which did not exist in order to prove the legitimacy of the Khilafah. And this is exactly why they needed it. They said that there was consensus, there was ijma', there was a widespread agreement, and this agreement was based on sound judgment. And this was the agreement of Fulan and Fulan and Fulan, and these were all the noble companions of the Prophet, and these people cannot make a mistake. You granted them infallibility while you were at it. They cannot make a mistake. And so that we must also accept their consensus. We must also accept their ijma'. And this is why ijma' became a necessary part of jurisprudence and principles of jurisprudence. In the Shia school of thought, it is either non-existent, the independent sort of consensus, the independent type of consensus, which is just as strong as the Quran and the Hadith. Either it is non-existent, or the ones which exist today are valueless, because their strength comes from the Quran or the Hadith. So the Shia scholars, they followed suit when it came to teaching consensus, when it came to promoting consensus. However, in other schools of thought, you find it as an independent source of ijtihad. So when you look at the Hanafi school of thought, the Hanbali school of thought, the Maliki school of thought, the Shafi'i school of thought, I'll give you examples. Al-Imam al-Ghazali, who was a famous Shafi'i scholar, in his book Al-Mustasfa al-Usul, where he speaks about jurisprudence and the principles of jurisprudence, he mentions the conditions of a mujtahid. Remember the first night when we spoke about the conditions of a mujtahid, who has the ability to derive Islamic law from their sources. He has to have a complete understanding of the Quran, complete understanding of the Hadith, a complete understanding of the characteristics of Rasulullah, an understanding of good behavior and etiquette, an understanding of consensus, ijma'. Also, the school of thought, the Shafi'i school of thought, Maliki school of thought, Hanbali school of thought, Hanafi school of thought, they also believe that one must be familiar with the consensus which has taken place over history. So he says that one essential branch of knowledge is consensus. And other schools of thought said the same thing. So consensus ijma' became an integral part of ijtihad, of the process of ijtihad. And what was the source? How do we legitimize consensus? Our scholars say that if consensus actually takes place, that it is not proper that if scholars count from 800 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, until 100 years ago, or until 10 years ago, or until now, if all of them passed a law, a verdict, presented a verdict, and the source of that verdict was consensus, not the Quran and the Sunnah, they say that it is not proper that these people be led astray, that there would be a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Quran or through the Ahl al-Bayt or through the 12th Imam. The scholars, they've mentioned their reasoning that it is not proper that they would be misguided. That if all of them accepted this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot leave His nation, as misguided. It must mean that they are right. Now some scholars accept this, some scholars did not accept this. However, in the Sunni school of thought, the school of thought which legitimized the Khilafah which took place after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they said the following. They said that this consensus gets its strength and its legitimacy from the hadith of Rasulullah, which says the following. The hadith of Rasulullah says, لا تجتمع أمتي على خطأ, that my nation does not unite in error. My nation does not make a mistake. Now this is true. This is true, that the nation does not unite in error. But I ask you, Has the nation ever united on anything? Has the nation ever united on anything? Have Muslims ever united on anything? From the time Rasulullah passed away until now, have all the Muslims, those who say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Have they ever united unanimously, all of them consented on one thing independently? Now you can say that, okay, all Muslims believe that there is no God but Allah. That's true, but that's already proven in the Quran. That's proven in the Hadith. Independently, besides the Quran and the Hadith, has there been anything which all of the Muslims were unanimous on, they consented on, they said, yes, all of us agree, from different schools of thought, from different jurisprudential schools of thought, different theological schools of thought. We all accept this. There's a unanimous agreement. There is a consensus, a legitimized consensus. Has this ever happened? It has never happened. Theoretically, it's beautiful. We hope that one day the Muslim Ummah will agree on one thing, at least one thing. But until then, practically, this hadith, not that it does not bear any fruits, because these are the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and with it he is trying to encourage us that we have consensus. Encourage us to agree amongst one another. Just like the Quran is telling us, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. However, practically speaking, the consensus never took place. Rasulullah himself foretold of the division that would take place among the Muslims. He would say that my nation will be divided into 72 parts or into 73 parts. That Banu Israel were divided to 72 parts. My nation shall be divided into 73 parts, 73 ways. And this is something that Rasulullah himself foretold. So there is no consensus, there is no actual agreement which took place. Yes, if there was an actual agreement, then we would accept ijma' and we would accept that first ijma' which took place. But even that first consensus which took place was not really a consensus. Because number one, there was not a general agreement among the nation, among the Muslim nation. If there was, then there would be no need to fight the wars of apostasy, hurub al-radda, which took place after the martyrdom of Rasulullah. And go and fight this tribe, go and fight that tribe, go and kill these people, go and massacre these people. Why? Because they did not accept what happened after the martyrdom of Rasulullah. Politically, they did not accept the political scheme. So what did they say? They say, that's fine. The entire ummah doesn't need to accept. Those who are important, the scholars of the ummah, the companions of the ummah, these are the people that need to accept in order for there to be a legitimate khilafah. Fine, we accept that too, but that didn't even take place. One of the first people to reject what happened at Saqifa, the decision which was taken for the khilafah after Rasulullah, one of the first people was Sa'ad ibn Ubadah. Sa'ad ibn Ubadah was the leader of the Ansar, the helpers, those who received Rasulullah in Medina. He was the first person to walk out on this process. And he did not accept what took place. And he left Medina. He went towards Sham and Damascus, where they say he was killed by a jinn. Mysterious circumstances. The first person not to accept, if you read the fate of Malik bin Nuwayra, the man who I mentioned the other day, whom did not accept the allegiance, and what happened to him? They killed him, they mutilated his body, they burned his head under their pots where they were cooking food. The other tribes which were harassed, the companions of Rasulullah which were harassed. Then you would understand these circumstances, that he was mysteriously killed by a jinn, the first and the last ever to be killed by a jinn. So there was no consensus, not among the greater Muslim ummah, and not even among those people who mattered, such as the companions. If there wasn't a consensus, then we would have no choice but to accept. I'll tell you this. We would have no choice but to accept. We could not say we cannot accept, that we reject this. We do not accept this notion. But the consensus never took place. The consensus in itself never took place. And from that day until today, of course, some of our divisions are beneficial. The Prophet said that اختلاف أمتي رحمة, that in some cases, when my nation is divided among themselves, sometimes they are divided in their opinion, that is a form of mercy. Because as Muslims, our convictions change. As people of intellect and of people who use their brain, who have sound judgment, our convictions may change from time to time. You don't have the same convictions, when you're 20 years old, the same convictions as when you're 50 or 60 or 70 years old. And two people may have different convictions, that's fine. But looking at the bigger picture, there has never been a solid, important issue which has been established and legitimized by ijma', by consensus. And the consensuses which do exist, they go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. They seek their strength from the Quran and the Sunnah. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. That hold steadfast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do not divide among yourselves. Regarding this verse, we turn to Hadith al-Thaqalain, where the Prophet says that I have left behind two things for you. I have left behind the book of Allah and my family. He says, Kitab Allah, hablun mamdud bayna as-sama'i wal-ard. That the book of Allah is a rope which extends from the ground, from the earth to the skies. So when Allah says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ, that hold steadfast to the rope of Allah, He is speaking about number one, the Quran. Hold steadfast to the Quran. If you want unity, follow the laws of the Quran. If you want cooperation, follow the laws of the Quran. If you want success, follow the laws and the guidelines of the Quran. In another hadith, narrated from the sixth Imam, Al-Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he says the following when reading this verse. He says, نَحْنُ حَبْلُ اللَّهِ الَّذِي قَالَ وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ. He says, we are the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which the verse refers to when it says, and hold steadfast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt, and they are inseparable. لَن يَفْتَرِقَا حَتَّى يَرْدَ عَلَيَّ الْحَوْض. They will not separate until they join me on the day of judgment. And then the Prophet continues, he says, look to yourselves how you will treat the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt during my absence. That they will not separate, they will come back to me. And ask yourselves how you will take care of the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt after my absence. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be among those who take care of the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt, who heed the call of the Quran and of Ahlul Bayt. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us and give us mercy and forgiveness in this holy month. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.